Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program comes to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, U.S. Defense Secretary James Mattis is in Beijing for a visit at a time of strained trade and military ties between China and the U.S. Could his visit help ease some of the rising tensions?
I'm going there to have a conversation.
And China makes its presence felt at the 2018 World Cup without a qualifying team. Are Chinese brand sponsors and the droves of Chinese soccer fans in it for the long run? We begin our program today in Beijing as U.S. Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis arrives Tuesday, kicking off his three-day visit to China. It is Secretary Mattis' first visit to China as Pentagon chief, and he says he's going into talks with Chinese officials without any preconceived notions. The top goal of his visit is said to be denuclearize the Korean Peninsula on the heels of a U.S. decision to drop China from taking part in Pacific naval exercises. As the U.S. Defense Secretary is known to be resolute on China's military affairs, could his visit lead to some consensus?
New talks with a new attitude. The U.S. Secretary of Defense, James Mattis, is adopting a less confrontational tone as he landed in Beijing, the first visit to China as Pentagon chief. While on his way, Secretary Mattis says he is ready for a conversation with China and indicated he has an open mind.
So I want to go in right now without basically poisoning the well at this point, as if my mind's already made up. I'm going there to have a conversation.
He says he wants to focus on strategic security issues rather than disputes in the South China Sea, softening his tone from last month when he criticized China's military behavior in the area, a claim China denies. Military relations have cooled between China and the U.S. after Mattis canceled China's invitation to the RIMPAC exercise. As a warning to Beijing, U.S. strategic bombers have patrolled the region, which prompted China to install more air defense systems on islands. Meanwhile, Washington's plan to sell more weapons to Taiwan has triggered strong protests from Beijing. The Chinese Foreign Ministry said military relations have always been an important part of China-U.S. ties, despite spiraling tensions between Beijing and Washington over trade.
关键是双方不管是在哪个领域
What's crucial is that both sides, no matter what area, can, in a spirit of mutual respect and understanding, expand cooperation and manage differences to appropriately handle disputes between the two countries.
The visit also comes at a critical time for diplomacy over the denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula after the Singapore summit. China has welcomed the decision to postpone joint U.S. military exercises with South Korea to give diplomacy a chance to work. And Mattis will visit U.S. allies South Korea and Japan before returning to Washington.
U.S. Secretary of Defense Mattis' visit to China at a time of turbulent relations between the two countries. Let's ask our panelists what can be achieved. With us in Beijing, we have Zhao Xiaoruo, who is the research fellow at the Academy of Military Sciences of Chinese PLA. Welcome, sir. Also welcome to our Beijing studio, Senior Captain Zhang Junshe, Vice President of China Naval Research Institute. Thank you, sir. And joining us in Washington, D.C. in the U.S., we invited Michael O'Halloran, who is a senior fellow from the Center for 21st Century Security and Intelligence, also Director of Research for Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution. Welcome as well, Mr. O'Halloran. I want to begin with you, Mr. O'Halloran, in Washington, D.C. Does the U.S. side see much can be achieved by Secretary Mattis' visit, given the fact that there's debate about his role in the administration, whether matter or not anymore?
Well, there are a lot of important questions to talk about today, but that's really not one of them, if you'll forgive me for saying so. Mattis has a great deal of influence in this administration, so we really shouldn't waste a lot of time on that question. Obviously, President Trump makes the decisions for the administration, but by all accounts and all impressions, Secretary Mattis is one of the most influential Secretaries of Defense that I believe we've had in modern times, and certainly one of the best. So I think it's more important to ask, what is he trying to achieve on this visit, and what are Chinese friends trying to achieve? And I think, yeah, and I believe, well, one thing that we need to know about Mattis is that he keeps his mind on and his eyes on the long game. He's a very careful, calm thinker. He's not prone to quick decisions or snap behavior or, you know, unpredictable behavior. You may recall right after Secretary Tillerson was confirmed in January 2017, Secretary Mattis took his first trip as Secretary of Defense to East Asia, and he calmed down discussion about the South China Sea. And he said that's something we can handle diplomatically, I believe. But he's also been very firm at continuing freedom of navigation exercises and maneuvers, and he's upset that China continues to want to reclaim and militarize islands in the South China Sea and claim the entire South China Sea for itself.
So my question really is...
I don't think he's going to achieve any new change.
Okay. All right, then. Let's ask our Chinese...
I don't think he's going to achieve anything. I think it's going to be a discussion. Philosophical
All right. What is going to be the discussion from the Chinese side? What are some of the issues, Mr. Zhao, that the Chinese side would like to discuss with Secretary Mattis?
Yes. We know last year in April, President Xi Jinping visited the United States and met U.S. President Donald Trump. And both presidents, they set up the dialogue. And one of the dialogues is the foreign and security dialogue. And under the framework of the dialogue, it encourages the Minister of National Defense from China and the Secretary of Defense from the United States to change the visits, to have more, communications, more changes.
So that's exactly also my question to you as well. So what are the issues to be communicated about that both sides will be interested in communicating about?
Yes, since last year, so many things has happened.
So what are these issues?
Great changes taking place in the Korean Peninsula, and we have witnessed that. And also in the South China Sea, that the U.S. has frequently conducted the freedom of navigation operations. And from the Chinese side, we think that is a challenge to China's sovereignty and national security. And also in the Taiwan issue, just recently, the Senate and the House of Representatives, they have, adopted the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act 2019. And under this act, it encourages joint military exercises.
So Taiwan issue is going to be one of those as well. So Mr. Zhang, let me ask you about it. There are a lot of issues that both sides do not see eye to eye about, and therefore make a discussion extremely difficult. So is there an easy point to begin with? I mean, after all, negotiations or discussions has to have some kinds of result, at least some kind of consensus. Only exchanging views will be a waste of time, some would argue. Mr. Zhang, what do you think?
Well, I don't think so. I think the talks and discussions Mr. Mattis will have with the Chinese state and military leaders will help promote mutual understanding and reduce misunderstanding, miscalculations, and avoid conflicts.
What do you think are the miscalculations that the Chinese side would love the U.S. to reduce in a way? So what are the issues that the Chinese side really need to communicate with the U.S. side and ask them to do what?
Well, Mr. Mattis, before he left for China, he said he will listen to what the Chinese leaders say. I think the miscalculation, misunderstanding of the U.S. side on the Chinese side may be the prominent issue.
Like what?
Like the South China Sea issue. The United States has been accusing China of militarizing the South China Sea. But China holds that it is the United States who has been militarizing the South China Sea by sending warships and military airplanes, just as Mr. Zhao said, into the territorial waters of China, the islands and reefs in the South China Sea, and the adjacent waters of the islands and reefs of China in the South China Sea to conduct the so-called freedom of navigation operations.
So you think this is the key issue. Mr. O'Hanlon, it seems that Mr. Mattis, as the Secretary, has a lot to answer from the Chinese side about the South China Sea issue. Chinese see it as misunderstanding, miscalculation, and also somewhat too much free willing coming from the U.S. side in the region.
Yeah, let me say a couple of things. First of all, if the South China Sea is our main issue of contention between Beijing and Washington, that would be fortunate, frankly, because I worry more day to day about North Korea and also Taiwan. I think those are both actually more dangerous issues. The South China Sea, I think we have to take a broad historical perspective, and I think Secretary Mattis is very good at this. On the one hand, we know that a rising China is going to want to have more influence in its neighborhood. That's the way that great powers behave. On the other hand, rising powers can also be dangerous because they sometimes try to do too much. And frankly, the South China Sea is international waters. And China has no business preventing other ships from trying to operate in that area. That's the United States' view. As to militarizing the South China Sea, I have a proposal. Why don't we agree we'll militarize it equally? In other words, let's stop it about where it is right now. I assess that the U.S. assets that occasionally go through the South China Sea are roughly comparable to what China has put on its reclaimed islands. Maybe we should all just call a moratorium and try to freeze at the level we're at right now. This could be a way to stabilize the situation.
Status quo, is that the really solution? Mr. Zhang?
I don't think the freedom of navigation operations conducted by the U.S. Navy is normal, because they have been conducted inside the territorial waters of China, for instance, in the Xisha Islands, the islands and the reefs which belong to China. It's not in the international waters.
Okay, kick the box, I guess. I guess the Secretary and the Chinese side has a lot to discuss about that. We can already see the demonstration of it among the three of you, gentlemen. Another issue that we need to move on, Mr. Zhao, is the DPRK issue, and shall we say even more specifically, the Korean Peninsula denuclearization. Korean Peninsula denuclearization means several things. That means DPRK's denuclearization. Yeah. It also means the apparatus and the kinds of so-called defense mechanism that the U.S. and its allies established for nuclear issues is also part of the Korean Peninsula denuclearization. Yeah. So will those issues be thoroughly discussed? Mr. Zhao?
Yes, I think so. You see, the denuclearization, I think it covers the DPRK. And also it covers the whole peninsula, Korean Peninsula, including the ROK to develop nuclear weapons, and also including the United States deploy nuclear weapons in the DPRK or the around areas. And just as we have witnessed over the past month, I think great changes has happened, and it is a move in a positive direction. You know, last year China raised the proposal of suspension for the DPRK to suspend the nuclear and missile launch tests, and from the United States and the ROK to suspend the joint military exercises. And we are lucky, we are fortunate to see this has been achieved. So
temporarily.
Temporarily, for the time being. So I think it is very important for the parties to concerned to keep the momentum.
All right. Mr. O'Hanlon, of course, it is well known that Secretary Mattis was actually informed later that there's going to be a suspension of joint military exercises between South Korea and the United States. It was announced first by the U.S. President Donald Trump in Singapore. Having said that, though, what about the military's role in making sure that so-called double suspension, that's the Chinese call it, what the U.S. call it, let's just make it that way, there's a joint statement, be in the United States, and that role of the Secretary Mattis?
Well, my view for a long time has been that the United States and the Republic of Korea have options of breaking our big exercises down into several smaller parts. And I think we can be just as effective in preparing our combat readiness in that approach. So I support this general concept of a freeze for a freeze, or whichever term you want to use. But it's also important to remember that as far as we know, North Korea's enrichment of uranium and its plutonium programs continue even today, even with this happier and warmer diplomacy. And so we have to keep some economic pressure on North Korea, in my judgment. The international community needs to keep enforcing the UN sanctions to make sure that Kim Jong-un doesn't just play us for time and use his smiling face and his sister's smiling face and his charm offensive to weaken the international community's resoluteness without actually making any changes in his own nuclear program.
Right.
So that's my concern. I'm hopeful about the diplomacy, but I think we need to keep in mind that North Korea is still building bombs as far as we can tell.
Mr. O'Hanlon, there are several issues. One is that within the administration, you heard different voices about the so-called timetable for DPRK to comply with its commitment that is signed into the joint declaration. Coming from the Defense Department, there seems to be a suggestion earlier that there has to be a timetable, and there is a timetable. But coming from the State Department, there's clearly waving of heads saying, no, there's no clear timetable, at least for the time being. So once again, what role will Secretary Mattis and his department play in the overall U.S. operation of working on the Korean Peninsula denuclearization issue is a very tricky one, apparently, Mr. O'Hanlon.
Well, I would say yes, ma'am. I would say two things. First of all, we need to. There doesn't have to be a schedule or a date in mind, but we need to move along this with some degree of urgency for the reason I just mentioned. North Korea continues to enrich uranium, continues to build nuclear bombs, so we have not yet reached anything like an improvement in the fundamental situation. But secondly, I don't think we necessarily need to expect North Korea to completely denuclearize, let's say, during President Trump's term in office. In fact, I was in Beijing last month speaking with many Chinese think tank experts who agree with me that the more realistic near-term goal is probably the dismantlement of North Korea's ability to make bombs, its ability to enrich uranium, to reprocess plutonium, to manufacture longer-range missiles.
Right.
And so if we could verifiably stop the production of these capabilities and dismantle the factories, that could be a very useful first step, even if North Korea holds on to most of its weapons of mass destruction for the foreseeable future. So this could be a phased approach, I believe.
Okay. Mr. Zhang here in Beijing, the so-called sanctions, different types of sanctions. There are UN-authorized sanctions, which China subscribed to, together with many other in the international community. And there's also unilateral sanctions coming from the United States mainly toward the DPRK. Of course, this summit in Singapore between the U.S. and the DPRK side seemed to have giving us some sign that something's going to change, but we don't know yet. So when Secretary Mattis coming to Beijing, Mr. Zhang, and talk about China, you should keep on the sanctions against the DPRK, keep on this pressure, what is likely to be China's answer, Mr. Zhang?
Well, I think Mr. Mattis will possibly discuss the cooperation between China and the United States on the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Actually, China firmly supports denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, and China has put forward two gestions. One is the dual suspension initiative, which has actually been adopted by the United States and North Korea. The other is the dual track approach. One is the peace mechanism, while the other is the denuclearization. So we think that the denuclearization process will take a long time. It should be carried out step by step. It can't be done overnight. So some people in the United States, their proposals are not so realistic, not so practical. So if there should be a timetable, it should be discussed by the United States and North Korea, not a unilateral timetable. That will not be accepted by North Korea, because North Korea will seek the security guarantee from the United States.
Right. So it has to be step by step, and they have to have a timetable with one another. One implemented, the other will implement their part. So that's how it goes. That's how it used to go in the six-party talks. Having said that, though, another issue, Taiwan, which is very important to China's agenda. This is what China considers a fundamental interest, a national interest. About that part, China has not been invited into the joint military exercises recently the U.S. held with its allies, even though China was invited last year, Mr. Zhao. But having said that, though, there are signs, as you mentioned earlier, the U.S. is likely to participate in some military joint exercises related to Taiwan. That's going to be a big issue for China, even though it is only a draft of legislation right now in the U.S.
Yeah. That is a very big and very dangerous move. I think, from the United States, they are quite clear. Taiwan issue is so sensitive to China, to Sino-U.S. relations. I think there are so many steps from the United States, from the Congress, from the administration, from the Pentagon. So many steps. I think the U.S. is pushing things, forward to a dangerous level. So here, I'd like to remind the United States, be careful. So the U.S. may, play fire, and if something happens, it will be, a big event.
Of course.
For the U.S. and for China-U.S.
That is exactly the final question. I want to go to you, Mr. O'Halloran, very briefly from you as well. With as an analyst, how do you see the turbulent time of China-U.S. relations as represented by the trade dispute that is going on right now? July the 6th is coming right now, so a lot of debates, a lot of anxieties in both countries, at least in the business circles. But whether people wonder it's going to spill over to the other sectors of the bilateral relations, military to military, for example, that's going to be extremely dangerous. Mr. O'Halloran, your thoughts?
Well, I do agree that these issues are linked in a very broad sense, which is that if they all tend to go badly at once, then one can imagine a climate of true distrust and lack of cooperation developing between China and the United States. I don't see that happening right now. I think we're having a lot of honest disagreements about the South China Sea. Both sides are being very resolute in their positions. I hope we can work towards some accommodation, but I see firmness on both sides, but I also see some cooperation on North Korea. And I agree with my Chinese friend. The United States and China both need to be careful about the Taiwan issue. And I think both sides actually appreciate that, although some people in Congress push this and some people in China push this a little. Overall, I don't think we've gotten to a point where all the issues are going in the wrong direction simultaneously, and I hope we never get there.
All right, that is our hope, certainly from this panel, the three of us, or the four of us. Thank you so much, the three gentlemen, for being with us. Zhao Xiaozhuo, Zhang Junshe, and Michael O'Halloran. Really appreciate it. Thank you. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. Big Chinese brands and throngs of Chinese soccer fans make their presence felt at the 2018 World Cup. Are they good for the games in the long run? Our sports commentators weigh in right after this break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. Although China's national team is not competing at the World Cup in Russia this year, there is a strong Chinese representation on and off the field. Chinese companies are pouring hundreds of millions into sponsorship rights and advertising, and Chinese fans are also flocking to Russia for the game. One unmistakable presence at the game is the bigger throng of Chinese fans. Before our discussion, take a look at this.
Chinese companies are the biggest sponsors of this year's FIFA World Cup. They have spent $835 million to buy brand exposure during the games, twice as much as what American companies spent. China's Wanda is sharing the top-level sponsorship with Adidas and Coca-Cola. Besides Wanda, FIFA also has 3 other second-tier sponsors: Those Chinese companies include Vivo, Mengniu, and Hisense. A number of Chinese companies are also active as third-tier regional sponsors.
Companies were initially focusing on the domestic market, but now they understand, or they've come to the point where they control the domestic market and they want to go abroad. And there was a bit of a natural fit with the biggest sport on earth. We have the only property has a global footprint, and it was the easiest thing for them to be able to go abroad using the most popular sport on earth.
It's not just in sponsorship where China's presence is being felt. Chinese football fans also remain 100% committed to the Cup. An estimated 100,000 Chinese tourists showed up at this year's World Cup. So far, FIFA said nearly 2.5 million tickets have already been sold worldwide. Chinese soccer fans bought more than 40,000 of those, putting it on the top 10 list.
I think it was great. At the moment that I saw Argentina kick off against Iceland, I was almost crying. I saw many Argentine fans dancing and singing, and even though I could not understand their language, I was wearing an Argentina jersey and dancing and singing along with them. It was really an unforgettable experience.
Besides the sponsorships and Chinese fans, this year's soccer ball was made in China, and Chinese companies have supplied the LED screens that are in a number of stadiums. The Chinese team may not have been good enough to qualify this year, but China is making sure its presence is felt during the world's largest sporting event.
Chinese presence at the World Cup 2018. Well, talk about that. In our Beijing studio, we have Pao Dong, who is the CEO of EI China Limited as a cultural communicator, even though he's here as a sports commentator. And also joining us here in our studio, we have Rowan Simons, chairman of the China Club Football. Rowan has been here in China pushing forward Chinese soccer for 20 years. Think about that, man. Well, first of all, strong Chinese presence in Russia, unprecedented. How do you like it?
I think it's great, and particularly Chinese fans to have the opportunity to join the World Cup. I think that's what it's all about.
Yeah.
Everyone coming together, uniting, celebrating the game. So I think you know, Chinese fans tend to be well behaved. They don't cause a lot of hooligan problems. They're very knowledgeable about the game. They're really enjoying their time. So I think it's wonderful to see.
Yeah. Well, the Chinese team is not there. It's not a secret.
It's still a very difficult challenge for China to qualify into the World Cup. It's not easy, but we're working very hard on this.
Yeah, and we're not going to talk about the whole reasons behind it today, but we talk about...
But it's a good sign that you have fans to care about it.
They do. You have a lot of fans in Russia, and you also have a lot of fans back at home watching overnight all those games. $385 million US. Chinese sponsorship contribute to a huge chunk of the overall sponsorship for the World Cup this year. Wow, the Chinese businesses are getting richer, and certainly they want to make their names heard. Paul.
Chinese sponsorship has already demonstrated their power during the Olympics, the past few editions of the Olympics, including the most recent Rio Olympics.
Yeah.
And China's sponsorship and China's business interest in sponsoring such mega events in sports have been on the rise, while the general trend in the world, the rest of the world, has been relatively flat, especially after the corruption scandal implicating FIFA. The FIFA found it difficult to extend some existing contract with some sponsors.
So is it going to be a temporary thing or a long-term thing, you think?
I think both temporary and long-term. I have confidence in the long-term interest from Chinese businesses and the mass overall.
The question is, to be there, to be seen and to be heard by whom? By the fans at home or by the rest of the international community? I think that's one of the issues when people are doing branding.
Yeah, you know, China has a huge domestic market, and people here love the World Cup. So certainly they'll be seeing the benefit in the domestic market. But in terms of international, those brands that really have consumer products that sell around the world, it is only mega events like the World Cup and the Olympics that can give you that reach. So in some cases, the Chinese companies do not yet have that global reach. So you have to question as to whether or not the finances make sense to spend. You're spending to reach the entire world.
What do you think the effectiveness of it?
I think in terms of domestic market, it's very impressive. I think Chinese people feel proud to see that their brands are there at the event.
Right.
I think internationally you can't help but avoid it. So I mean, for sure there are millions of Europeans, Americans around the whole world looking at, wondering what is Wanda, what are those Chinese characters for Mengniu, Vivo, and so these
and Hisense, and together with others, altogether 19 sponsorships.
That's right. So they are certainly sort of introducing themselves to the world, but it's a very, very big event to carry. So I'm not sure how much the bottom line actually comes back, but there are other reasons for doing so.
Agree?
Yeah, I still think the primary target of such sponsorship is still the domestic Chinese market. Don't forget that the CCTV and among other online platforms have been relaying every match, targeting those new fans and together with the old soccer fans watching overnight some very late matches.
Are you guys watching also?
Yeah, I mean,
when I can. Over there, I can understand there's a time difference, and therefore you guys
tiring.
4 hours every day.
You know, I'm still supporting my team, England, so we have some vested interest in there. I think it must be maybe harder for the fans of.
I have
he also has some vested interest over there. The tie really tells the story over there.
It reflects my attitude for tonight's match.
It's gonna be. But having said that, though, 40,000 Chinese soccer fans in Russia, literally. Think about that. I mean, if you look at the stadium, there's a huge chunk of them that are coming from the People's Republic of China.
Let me correct you.
Go ahead.
They are World Cup fans, not necessarily soccer fans. This is a phenomenon that, which is very unique in China. Many people, including many young ladies, fall in love with the World Cup.
Make sure there's no gender bias in your statement at all.
Knowing the basic rules about soccer.
Okay, that used to be a joke that has been circulating on China's internet.
Well, the World Cup is bigger than football, isn't it? It's a global celebration. I think it makes perfect sense that Chinese people want to be part of it.
It's a festival.
A festival
for a lot of people.
Part of their lifestyle.
Exactly. And if it coincides traveling to Russia, see a different country, it will be even better.
Yeah, really good.
Having said that, though, the earlier question that you mentioned, I have to come back to that, about the Chinese team. For the past years, you see a lot of concern about why Chinese team is not there. And you see, little by little, that voice is gone. People don't ask that question anymore. Is it people becoming more mature about where China is and how long it takes to really develop a good team, like South Korea and Japan does these days? Or people are just switching their interest to somewhere else, even though they love soccer, even though they love football, and they love the World Cup?
Yeah, I mean, there's always this difference between loving football as a spectator and loving football as a participant. So in China, certainly in terms of the entertainment spectacle, China's really fully embraced it. But we haven't yet seen Chinese people get out and go and play the game with the same passion and the same level of commitment that we get in many other football nations. And that's why their interest in the game is not translating into performance on the pitch. Not enough people are actually getting enthusiastic about watching the World Cup and then going out and playing the game themselves.
Are you, Paul?
I think Roland, because based on what he has been doing for more than a decade in China, he has been caring so much about how to develop the sport among young kids on the grassroots. But I would rather divide the spectators into several groups. Some of them just want to go there because Russia happens to be the next destination for their travel. And at the same time, some people are getting increasingly frustrated and more and more impatient about the performance of their national team. But at the same time, some other people just take the World Cup as kind of entertainment.
Which is fine too. Which is fine.
Yeah, we have to face it. These are various types of opportunities, business opportunities for advertising, for marketing.
And what about just for people to have some fun? I think that's also a great opportunity. Entertainment. If it comes from sports, it's wonderful.
Yeah, football matches are reality shows.
Yes, having said that, though, what about how to transcend that? I mean, to make sure, or to make, at least to a certain extent, some of those spectators will eventually become someone who will kick a ball around the corner of the street?
You know, really, that's not something that comes with government support or even sponsorship
You're
support.
not losing your enthusiasm, are you?
No, I mean, I'm not, but it's something that has to come from within. And, you know, we look around the world, we see some very poor places in the world, like Africa, very poor conditions, but football is everywhere there.
Yeah.
Even if you don't have a pitch, people are playing. And it's this passion that's missing in China, I think. And so, yes, they can watch the spectacle, they can watch the entertainment, it's like Hollywood. The great stars are playing there, but actually going out on a weekly basis and supporting your local club, committing to that, turning up on time, playing when it's raining, when it's cold, this level of the passion, I think we have yet to see in China.
Yeah, that's why one thing. The other thing, you see a lot of people take ownership of being the fan of a particular team. For example, Paul, your tie, as I mentioned earlier, certainly demonstrate that. What is it like for Chinese fans? I mean, trying to be a fan of a particular team that is not your national team, and yet at the same time extremely enthusiastic about that team. That's quite an interesting emotional commitment.
Yeah, that's why I would still call, despite all the disagreement or, controversies, I would still call the China market one of the most open markets in the world. In almost every field, people travel out and buy various brands from overseas, from other countries, and they embrace American-type TV dramas. They consume a large variety of foreign services.
So once again,
goods,
as consumers,
including soccer.
Yeah, I think I said that it's a consumption issue, isn't it? So you might have your favorite musician or your favorite film star, and you'll have your favorite club or your favorite player.
We've heard a lot of stories related to Ronaldo and to Messi and these big figures, and they become the most popular figures now in China, at least during the time of the World Cup. And certainly they have huge market values here in China. So what does this mean? I mean, this Chinese enthusiasm of the World Cup, what does it mean for the other brands, commercial opportunities for, just international businesses as well?
You mean in China?
Yeah.
Well, you say the Chinese market is quite open, but Chinese domestic football has some very strong domestic owners of the game, owners of the clubs, and they have their own objectives, and I don't think necessarily those are financial. In some cases they're political. So I think for Western businesses entering into the China market, it's a long-term process. I mean, our sponsor Nike is an example of that, with a long-term deal with the Chinese Development League. So there is a market here for both international businesses and Chinese businesses, but the biggest trend is China now coming to be a real player in the international market.
Paul?
But it's undeniable that big brands like Adidas or Nike and Under Armour, they have huge fan bases where they can build their sales here in China, because they are only fans of LeBron James, Cristiano Ronaldo, all Western, all foreign stars, and they have huge fan base here in China. And these businesses, I mean top brands from outside of China, are really cashing in this market. And for example, a few days ago, the British Embassy partnering together with Hisense to host a large group of Chinese fans and also viewers to watch on the big screen England versus Panama, actually to introduce British culture and tourism.
A lot of opportunities for all kinds of countries. Having said that, though, you see a lot of debate on China's social media about what team likely to win, and they even bet on that. What do you make of that culture now? It seems to be a new phenomenon, apparently. Paul?
Well, betting or gambling on results are popular around the world, and Chinese people are no less skillful in this regard. I think given the large demographic base or population, I wouldn't be surprised that Chinese are the most active. We heard some tragic news about those who lose and who lost, and actually they chose to do something dramatic.
So it seems, Rowan, that a lot of things, branching out that's related to soccer, has been very much embraced by the demographic, and yet soccer itself, and how to make sure, even after decades of setbacks and challenges, that the Chinese will be keen on it. Are you reading some signs?
I think it is difficult. There is a danger, and the question is very good, you know, that actually China may become divorced from the game itself, and it just becomes an entertainment spectacle that they don't really have a feeling that they will be part of. That would be terrible. I mean, China really does need to get back to basics and develop its team and get into the World Cup, perform well in the World Cup. But I think there is certainly a danger that we're losing the participation nature of sport in China, and it's just becoming.
You're waving your head. Paul certainly do not agree with you.
Yeah, I would encourage you to be more positive. I mean, see the positive things, the aspects of the development. Don't forget that just 3 years ago, the Chinese government targeted 2020 to have at least 20,000 primary and junior middle schools to teach football classes regularly. And now, 2 years before that target time, that target has already been achieved.
Yeah, I think
it means that more and more parents are allowing their kids.
We have 40 seconds left.
Misses the point. Schools football is compulsory football. What we need is voluntary football. We need kids who are not being told by school or by government to go and play, to get out and enjoy the game on their own merits,
Final
rather
words.
than be forced
But
to
we
play.
progressed to that height from the very basic
All right, we're running out of time, gentlemen. Thank you so much for being with us. Certainly a lot of games to watch tonight as well, so thank you for sharing your precious time, particularly during the evening hours here in Beijing time with us. Dongjun, Rowan, Simon, thank you so much for being with us. Have fun, you guys. So, that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Inside CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Inside team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world.